The world woke to a jolt from the heart of Africa, in Ouagadougou. Before dawn, soldiers stood in silence while a single order shattered decades of tradition. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, young yet unyielding, dared to do what few had even whispered: confront the great powers head-on. He was not simply moving diplomats, he was moving history. Flags that had flown for generations trembled in the hot Sahel wind. And in that moment, millions asked themselves a question they had long buried. Can a poor nation choose dignity over dependence and still survive? The events of mid-August did not come from nowhere. For months, tension had simmered between Burkina Faso's military leadership and international institutions. Reports issued abroad accused local forces of abuses, even equating them with the extremists they had fought for years. To many in the West, these were routine documents, dry and bureaucratic. But inside Ouagadougou, they landed like a slap across the face of a wounded nation. Captain Ibrahim Traoré gathered his ministers in the presidential palace. Witnesses describe a silence thick enough to choke, broken only by the hum of a ceiling fan. Page by page, he turned the latest foreign report, his brow furrowed deeper with each line. At last, he struck the oak table with his palm. The sound echoed like a gunshot. 2 million of our citizens displaced since 2016. Thousands dead. And yet they call our soldiers criminals. It declared. The words reverberated not just through the chamber, but through the airwaves that night when state television replayed them again and again. Outside, the streets of Ouagadougou swelled with chants. Placards bore a single phrase: sovereignty is not for sale. For an older generation, it was a haunting refrain, reminiscent of independence rallies half a century earlier. For the young, it was a spark of identity, proof that they were not invisible on the global stage. Diplomats, meanwhile, hurriedly packed their belongings. Behind the iron gates of foreign compounds, staff lowered flags that had long been symbols of power. To those watching, it was not mere protocol, it was theater, an emblem of defiance staged against the might of nations with resources far beyond the Sahel. Some cried treachery, others whispered courage, but none could deny the gravity. Traoré's stance was clear: aid without respect was a chain, not a gift. Better hunger and freedom than bread and humiliation, he told his advisors. For a country already reeling from food shortages, it was a brutal philosophy. Yet for many, it carried an undeniable resonance. In villages across the savannah, farmers repeated it almost word for word, as though it were scripture. The idea was stark. Survival means little if purchased at the price of dignity. International reaction was swift. In Washington, officials spoke of suspension of assistance. In Paris, commentators muttered about recklessness. In Brussels, the language was more careful concerning isolation. They called it. But in Moscow, state television lit up with applause, hailing Traoré as a lion of Africa. Beijing, ever cautious, sent quiet emissaries with offers of cooperation. Every capital saw in Ouagadougou's decision not just a local quarrel, but a signal, a shift in who speaks for Africa and who listens. Inside Burkina Faso, however, the debate was raw and immediate. Ministers worried aloud. Clinics already faced medicine shortages. Schools had closed by the thousands. How would they cope without outside funds? Traoré listened, then responded with calm steel. A school built on chains teaches only slavery. A clinic funded with disdain cannot heal. The room fell silent. It was not simply policy, it was a declaration of creed. And so the story of one morning in August became larger than a diplomatic dispute. It became a question of identity, of narrative, of who writes the story of Africa. As crowds gathered in the capital square, waving new banners of the Sahel Alliance, one elderly veteran leaned on his stick and whispered, "They called us beggars. Today, we answer as a nation." The chapter closed not with the lowering of a flag, but with the raising of a challenge. If dignity is chosen above all else, can a fragile state withstand the storm that follows? The world, and the people of Burkina Faso, waited for the answer. The storm did not wait long. Within hours of the embassy gates closing, the air in Ouagadougou grew thick with both pride and fear. Radios buzzed with urgency. Families huddled to hear whether food supplies would still come, whether clinics would keep their shelves stocked, and always the same question returned: was dignity enough to fill an empty stomach? In Washington, the message was blunt. A senior official, speaking with calculated calm, announced, assistance will be suspended until constitutional order and accountability are restored. The figure of over $100 million, once guaranteed annually, for health and education, now hung in the balance. For the people of Burkina Faso, it was not an abstract number. It meant vaccines that might never arrive, classrooms without chalk or books, clinics where mothers might be turned away. The threat was real, and everyone knew it. Paris reacted with sharper words, almost anger. Traoré is cutting the last rope to Europe, one diplomat muttered before the cameras. In Brussels, the tone was bureaucratic but no less heavy. Isolation, risk, grave concern. Each phrase piled pressure on a government already fighting for survival against insurgents. And yet, in Moscow, television anchors beam, "This is emancipation," declared a Russian commentator, a young lion standing against neo-colonial chains. In Beijing, there were no fireworks, only a quiet delegation arriving with offers, loans, without lectures, aid without conditions. Ankara too weighed in, promising hospitals and schools in the Sahel as part of a new brotherhood. The map of alliances was shifting before the world's eyes. Inside the presidential palace, the atmosphere was more fragile. Ministers sat in tense silence, sweat beading despite the whir of ceiling fans. One by one, they voiced their fears. The Minister of Education warned, "We have already closed 6,000 rural classrooms. Without foreign support, our system collapses." The Minister of Health added grimly, "Clinics report shortages. Are we ready to watch our sick die for lack of antibiotics?" Each voice carried the weight of reality, and yet, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood firm. He walked to the window, gazing out at the dusty streets, then turned with calm defiance. "A school built on chains is no true school. A clinic built on contempt is no place of healing." The room fell silent. His creed was clear: freedom first, survival second. Beyond the palace walls, the people wrestled with the same dilemma. In the markets, women debated the rising price of rice. In hospitals, doctors counted dwindling bottles of medicine. On local radio, a farmer from the Sahel was asked if he feared hunger without aid. His reply was steady: "Better to be hungry with dignity than full with chains. Bread that bows the head is not worth eating." His words spread like wildfire, repeated from village to village, until they reached the capital itself. What began as one man's conviction became a people's refrain. International analysts shook their heads. Some called it reckless, even suicidal. Others whispered admiration for a nation willing to gamble everything for self-respect. In editorial rooms from Paris to New York, headlines clashed. Burkina Faso risks collapse stood beside a bold stand against neo-colonialism. The same event was painted either as folly or as freedom, and in that clash of narratives lay the deeper struggle: who gets to define the story of Africa? For older Burkinabe, the echoes of history were unmistakable. They remembered the independence movements of the 1962nd, the fiery speeches of leaders who demanded that their people walk tall. Traoré's words, "Better hunger and freedom than bread and humiliation," were not new. They were a return to an old base-lead, unfinished dream. For the young, who had grown up under the shadow of conflict and aid dependency, it was something different. A promise that their sacrifices might mean something greater than survival. As night fell on the capital, crowds gathered once more in the central square. Torches flickered, drums beat, and chants rose into the hot Sahel air. They were not celebrating victory. They were bracing for hardship, but within the rhythm of their voices lay a conviction stronger than fear. One banner caught the torchlight: "Our sovereignty is our survival." The crowd roared in agreement, and yet, unanswered questions lingered. Could solidarity alone keep the clinics open? Could pride alone keep children in school? Dignity was priceless, but survival demanded more. The world watched, divided between admiration and alarm. And in Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré prepared for the next test, knowing that storms gather quickly in the Sahel. Pride, by itself, does not stock a pharmacy. Dignity, alone, does not reopen 6,000 shuttered classrooms. By the end of August, the pressure on Burkina Faso had begun to sharpen into something colder, harder. Foreign capitals had moved past words and into measures. In Washington, the suspension of assistance was not a threat anymore. It was a decree. Health funds were frozen, development projects placed on indefinite hold. In Paris, officials whispered about restricting trade routes. Brussels spoke of sanctions, cloaking economic punishment in the language of concern for stability. The message was unmistakable. If Ouagadougou would not bend, it would break. Inside the presidential palace, the debate turned raw. Ministers gathered again around the long oak table. Papers spread, voices raised. The Minister of Education was the first to speak, her voice taut with frustration. "Our schools are collapsing," she said. "Already thousands of children sit idle. What future will they inherit if we starve the system of support?" Across from her, the Minister of Health added, "Clinics cannot run on slogans. Without supplies, without antibiotics, people will die." The silence that followed was heavy with accusation. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not flinch. He listened, his gaze fixed, before answering with measured steel. "And what legacy do we leave?" he asked. "If we teach our children that freedom is for sale, if the only medicine we offer is dependence, a school built on chains teaches only servitude. A clinic funded with disdain is no place of healing." His words cut through the chamber, leaving even his critics quiet. Yet, unease lingered. Principles inspire, but policies must feed. Beyond the palace walls, the people themselves wrestled with the contradiction. In markets, women haggled bitterly as prices crept upward. A sack of rice cost more than many could pay. Doctors counted the last vials of antibiotics, aware of what shortages meant for the sick. On the radio, callers argued fiercely. Some demanded that Traore restore relations for the sake of survival. Others insisted that hunger endured in dignity was better than abundance chained to humiliation. The nation itself had become a forum, each voice echoing the same impossible question. But in the midst of isolation, a new flag began to rise. From Bamako to Niamey, from Ouagadougou to remote Sahel towns, the green and red banner of the Alliance of Sahel States appeared on walls, in marches, in the hands of young demonstrators. Formed with Mali and Niger, the AES declared solidarity against both jihadist terror and external domination. Together we stand. Its leaders announced, an alliance born not of convenience, but of necessity. In Ouagadougou's central square, crowds waved the banner with fervor, as if to say, we are not alone, we are not abandoned. International observers watched with unease. In Paris, commentators spoke of a dangerous bloc of juntas. In Washington, strategists worried aloud. What if other nations followed this example? What if the dominoes fell, one by one, until American influence across the Sahel was reduced to ash? In Moscow, however, state media celebrated. Anchors called Traore the young lion, an emblem of Africa's awakening. In Beijing, envoys worked quietly, offering infrastructure and loans, careful not to appear overbearing. And in Ankara, officials promised to expand hospitals and schools, branding themselves brothers in faith and development. Every new pledge, every handshake, deepened the rift with the West. Inside Burkina Faso, the symbolism mattered as much as the material. Students painted murals of the AES flag rising as the old foreign banners lowered. In dusty villages, children sang songs that wove together pride and defiance. And in the capital, veterans of older independence, struggles nodded with weary recognition. We have been here before, one remarked, leaning on his cane. But this time, perhaps we will finish the journey. Still, the question remained. Could an alliance of fragile states withstand the weight of international isolation? The relentless advance of insurgents, the daily hunger of their people. Could defiance alone shield a nation when the warehouses emptied and the medicines ran out? For Traore and for Burkina Faso, the answer would have to come quickly. The storm was still gathering, and the world was waiting to see who would be left standing when it broke. Hunger has a way of speaking louder than politics. In the weeks after the expulsions, the proud chants of sovereignty began to mix with quieter murmurs of worry. Markets across Ouagadougou saw prices climb. A bag of rice that once fed a family now cost more than many could afford. Women in bright patterned cloth stood in long queues at water pumps, muttering about shortages. In rural clinics, nurses rationed antibiotics, choosing who would receive treatment and who would wait. The dream of dignity was real, but so too was the gnawing emptiness in people's stomachs. The voices of doubt grew bolder. In radio debates, callers demanded answers. We cannot eat slogans, said one man. We need bread, not speeches. Another caller, an elderly woman, replied with fire. What is bread worth if it chains us to humiliation? Hunger passes, shame does not. The argument spread through every corner of society, dividing households, villages, even friends. Burkina Faso had chosen a path of sovereignty. But could sovereignty alone keep its people alive? Captain Ibrahim Traoré understood the weight of the moment. One morning, without warning, he left the palace and traveled to a camp of displaced families on the city's edge. More than 2 million Burkinabe had been driven from their homes by years of jihadist violence. In makeshift tents of tarpaulin and sticks, families waited, exhausted and uncertain. Children played barefoot in the dust, their laughter thin and fleeting. When the captain arrived, the crowd gathered quickly. Mothers stepped forward. Fathers stood stiffly, unsure what to expect. Traore walked among them, his uniform simple, his boots dusty from the same red earth. He listened more than he spoke. A mother told him she had buried her son after militants raided their village. A father said he had no land left to farm. A child asked the simplest question of all, will we eat tomorrow? The captain knelt down, looked the boy in the eyes, and answered softly, maybe not enough today, but what we have is ours. And one day, you will grow, knowing freedom feeds the soul more than bread. Cameras caught the moment. That night, state television did not broadcast speeches or statistics. It showed a small hand resting inside a soldier's bier. The image swept across the nation, imprinting itself on memory. Still, hardship pressed in. Teachers warned that without salaries, more classrooms would shut their doors. Doctors whispered of preventable deaths if supplies did not arrive. Ministers debated in private, some urging compromise with the West to reopen aid channels. But Traore's response remained steady. A nation that survives on another's mercy is no nation at all. His defiance inspired many, yet for others, it deepened fear. Could a country truly walk this path alone? Beyond Burkina Faso, the ripple effects were visible. In Bamako and Niamey, leaders of the Sahel Alliance praised the visit, calling it proof of leadership rooted in people, not palaces. In Europe, commentators dismissed it as theater. In Washington, officials privately wondered how long public patience could last before hunger turned into protest. Everyone, it seemed, was waiting for the breaking point. Back in the camp, however, the moment lingered. The boy's question echoed in the minds of parents and soldiers alike. Food would always matter. Medicine would always matter. But so, too, did dignity. The dilemma was stark. Could the fire of pride keep a nation from freezing in despair? The hunger for food was joined by another hunger, the hunger for truth. As shortages grew sharper, so too did the stories told about Burkina Faso. Across the West, headlines carried words like rogue nation, reckless junta, collapse imminent. Television anchors spoke with solemn certainty. Burkina Faso was isolating itself into oblivion. Few mentioned the millions displaced by jihadist violence, or the mothers burying children after village raids. Few repeated the chants echoing through Ouagadougou's streets. Sovereignty is not for sale. Instead, the nation was painted with a single-brush troublemaker, unstable, doomed. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, this was the most dangerous front of all. They call our soldiers criminals, he told his ministers, holding up a foreign report. When they rescue our daughters, they are called abusers. When they defend our villages, they are branded violators. Who gave them the authority to write our truth? His voice rose, not in anger, but in challenge. This war is not only fought with bullets, it is fought with words, and words can wound deeper than knives. Across the city, evidence of this new battle appeared in vivid colors. On a wall in central Ouagadougou, a young artist painted a mural, the American flag lowered, the Sahel Alliance banner rising. Beneath it, a phrase in bold strokes, "Our story, our pen." Passersby stopped to stare. Some whispered, others wept. The mural captured what speeches could not: the fight to reclaim identity, to seize back authorship from outsiders. The government amplified this struggle. State radio replayed the voices of farmers and veterans, not just officials. A veteran leaning on his stick was heard saying, "They called us beggars for generations. Today we answer, we are not for sale." In villages, choirs of schoolchildren sang lines stitched from old independent songs and new slogans of defiance. Even without chalkboards or textbooks, they learned something their elders deemed more essential: pride. International reaction was split along familiar lines. In Paris, editorials darkened, warning of a powder keg in the Sahel. In Washington, senators debated openly whether Burkina Faso's defiance might inspire others. Mali, Niger, perhaps beyond. If one small nation can reject us, a lawmaker warned, what happens if others follow? Fear crept into the corridors of power where obedience had long been assumed. Meanwhile, in Moscow, commentators hailed the captain as a symbol of emancipation. In Beijing, officials quietly doubled their outreach, framing cooperation as respect rather than control. Every narrative carried its own agenda, but the central stage was no longer in New York or Paris. It was in Ouagadougou, and Traore knew it. Still, the internal strain was undeniable. Ministers continued to press the harsh arithmetic: schools without funding, clinics without medicine, markets with soaring prices. Citizens argued on radio and in markets, balancing pride against hunger, dignity against survival, and yet, the words of the captain, "Better hunger with dignity than bread in servitude," echoed louder than spreadsheets or reports. For many, it was not mere rhetoric, it was survival of the spirit, even when the body ached. At night, the capital pulsed with torchlit marches. Banners of the Sahel Alliance fluttered against the dark sky, carried by students and elders alike. Drums beat, voix rose, and a chant thundered across the square. No more borrowed voices. For an older generation, it felt like history repeating. For the young, it felt like history beginning anew. The battle was no longer simply about aid or sanctions. It was about narrative: who tells Africa's story, and who listens. But beyond the chants and murals, international media had the louder megaphone. Western governments had the deeper pockets. Could Burkina Faso's voice carry far enough, loud enough, to resist the storm of condemnation? Or would its words, however fierce, be drowned out by the weight of global opinion? The chorus of global powers was deafening. Western commentators repeated the same refrain: isolation, collapse, failure. Sanction loomed, aid remained suspended, and the threat of hunger grew sharper by the day. Yet in Ouagadougou, the answer was not silence. It was song, drum, and defiance. The people of Burkina Faso refused to vanish beneath the weight of prediction. They carried their voices into the night, determined to be heard. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood once more before his ministers. The same oak table lay between them, but the air had changed. Weariness hung heavy, yet so too did resolve. They say we are reckless, he told them quietly. They say we cannot survive without their grace. But tell me, what nation has ever grown strong by kneeling? What child has ever learned pride from dependence? His words were not shouted. They were spoken with the steady conviction of a man who believed history itself was listening. Beyond the palace walls, that conviction had already taken root. In Bamako, Niamey, and across the Sahel, the green and red banner of the alliance flew higher than ever. Students painted new murals, declaring, "Our sovereignty is our survival." Farmers repeated it in markets. Elders recited it at village gatherings. The phrase became more than a slogan, it became a creed, binding communities that had long felt abandoned by the world. In Europe, alarm deepened. Analysts spoke of a dangerous precedent. If Burkina Faso's defiance spread, what would become of Western influence across Africa? In Washington, senators demanded tighter measures, but privately, they wondered if pressure alone could break a nation that had already chosen sacrifice. In Moscow and Beijing, the opposite mood prevailed, admiration mixed with calculation. Each saw opportunity in a continent, seeking to reclaim its voice. And in Ankara, promises of solidarity grew louder, branding the Sahel as a brotherhood of faith and endurance. But for ordinary Burkinabe, geopolitics meant little compared to daily survival. Prices still climbed. Clinics still ran dry. Hunger still gnawed. Yet when asked, many repeated the same refrain. Better hunger and freedom than bread and humiliation. It was no longer just a leader's slogan. It had become the people's shield against despair. In dusty villages, mothers taught it to their children. In classrooms that remained open, teachers wrote it on chalkboards. The phrase passed from lips to lips, until it felt like an inheritance. One evening, as dusk settled over Ouagadougou, Traore addressed the nation. His figure, illuminated against the twilight, carried neither arrogance nor apology. "This is not about one embassy or one aid package," he said. "It is about the right to speak in our own voice. For too long, others have written our story. Today, we hold the pen. Tomorrow, our children will write the chapters." The crowd erupted, not in celebration, but in recognition. They knew the road ahead was hard. Yet for the first time in generations, they believed it might be their own. And so, the chapter of August closed not with resolution, but with a question that stretched far beyond Burkina Faso. Can dignity feed a nation? Can sovereignty build schools, stock clinics, and keep hunger at bay? Or must pride bend eventually to the weight of survival? The answer remained unwritten, waiting in the hands of a people who had chosen to stand. For Africa, the message was clear. One small nation had dared to break the script. Whether it marked the dawn of a new era, or the echo of a fleeting dream, the world was watching. And somewhere in the heart of the Sahel, a voice whispered into the wind, "Our story, our pen."